Can I start?
Yes. We are live now.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're speaking on the third part of the three-part series called Unlocking Industrial Growth series in the Industrial Policy Commission of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. Today, we'll be speaking about stability, infrastructure, institutions, and finance, and that how together all these factors help to provide an enabling environment for accelerating Nigeria's industrialization. Today, we have a rich panel of specialists who will be speaking on different aspects in relation to today's theme. And we also have well-renowned speakers as well who will be sharing their thoughts. So we look forward to today's session and also feedback from our listeners. Thank you. So we'll go on to the welcome address from Dr. Segun Adaju. Dr. Segun Adaju is the CEO of Consistent Energy Limited, and he's the member of the Industrial Policy Commission Steering Committee here at the Nigeria Economic Summit Group. Dr. Adaju, please.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Heads of MDAs, captains of industry, heads of associations, the donor communities, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the board and management of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this pre-summit event titled Unlocking Industrial Growth Series, the Evolving Oil and Gas Ecosystem, which is hosted by the Industrial Policy Commission of the NESG. This is one of the pre-summit events of the NES 31, that is the 31st Nigeria Economic Summit, jointly organized by NESG and the Federal Ministry of Budget and Economic Planning. The NES 31 pre-summit events are geared towards engaging stakeholders in a series of virtual conversations and sessions in the weeks leading to the NES 31, which is scheduled to hold from the 6th to the 8th of October 2025. If you haven't registered, I'll kindly invite you to do so, and I'll request the admin to post the link in the chat room where you can click and register. Nigeria stands at a crucial juncture in its industrial development. Our question today is both urgent and profound. How can we strengthen the fundamental enablers of stability, infrastructure, institutions, and finance to drive sustainable industrial competitiveness and national transformation? Despite all the vast natural resources that Nigeria is endowed with and the human capital, the industrial sector has underperformed. In 2024, for example, manufacturing contributed less than 10% to the GDP, actually 8.5%, compared to Egypt, which is 12.4%, and South Africa, 13.1%. Manufacturing value added per capita stands at only $216 US dollars, far behind South Africa's $645 US dollars and Egypt's $524 US dollars. And this explains why we continue to rely heavily on imports, with manufactured goods particularly accounting for 70% of our imports in 2023. Yet there are global success stories from which we can draw lessons from. Malaysia, for example, leveraged deliberate industrial policies and clusters to raise its manufacturing share of GDP to 23%. Nigeria should not be doing less than 20%, really. While Chile transformed its copper wealth into competitive value chains, lifting its GDP per capita above 15,000 US dollars. Even Rwanda, with fewer natural resources, has demonstrated how institutional reforms and stable governance can attract industrial investments, resulting in a 17% annual growth in manufacturing exports between 2015 and 2022. The AU the African Union's Agenda 2063 strongly advocates resource-based industrialization, coupling natural resources with innovation, industrial clustering, and strong institutional governance. For example, Nigeria provides a roadmap to convert 44 solid mineral types. Is an opportunity for us, okay, to do this. And also 84 million hectares of variable land and 37 billion barrels of crude oil reserves, and also over 200 trillion cubic feet of gas reserves that we have into globally competitive industrial assets. Encouragingly, early signs of progress already exist. The special agro-processing zones launched in 2022 are projected to attract over $1 billion US in private investments. The Nigerian Oil and Gas Park schemes, NOGAPS, aims to create over 30,000 direct jobs by localizing manufacturing for the petroleum sector. While in the solid mineral sector, recent policy reforms seeks to increase the sector's contribution to GDP from 0.6% to 5% by 2025. 2035. These initiatives are promising, but require scaling and stronger policy coherence. Now, to unlock Nigeria's industrial future, deliberate action must be taken in 4 critical areas. 1, stability around policy. We have policy inconsistencies in Nigeria, which cost estimated over $14 billion US annually in foreign direct investment that are lost. Predictably in rules and governance is non-negotiable. You must be able to predict rules and governance. Number 2 is infrastructure. Power remains our most significant bottleneck. With an average of less than 5,000 megawatts that we get for over 200 million people, manufacturing firms spend averagely about 40% of their operating costs to generate energy for themselves. Transport inefficiencies, including port congestions, also add an estimated $9 billion US to annual logistic costs. The third pillar is institutions. We have weak structural frameworks, which have been linked to annual loss of about $10 billion due to trade bottlenecks, corruption, and regulatory inefficiencies. Strong, accountable institutions are the bedrock of competitiveness. And number 4 is finance. So Nigeria's credit to the private sector is just about 14% of GDP, far below South Africa's 48% and Malaysia's 120%. Without long-term affordable capital, manufacturing and industrial clusters cannot scale. So this session, the third in the series, I remember the industrial growth series, is designed to not merely to identify gaps, but to co-create actionable pathways for strengthening these enablers. At this core, industrialization is not only about figures, but about people. With over 4.5 million Nigerians entering the labor market annually, industrial growth is crucial for creating jobs, reducing poverty, positioning Nigeria competitively within the AFTA, and a market of about 1.4 billion people and an opportunity of GDP of about $3.4 trillion US. I sincerely thank you all for honoring this invitation. Your insights and commitments will be instrumental in shaping the bold, actionable agenda that will define NES 31 and chart Nigeria's path to industrial competitiveness. Finally, I implore you once again to kindly register for NES 31, either through the NESG website or the link that will be shared, so that you can join other experts and stakeholders in articulating an agenda on the reform imperatives for building a prosperous and inclusive Nigeria by 2030. May God bless the Federal Republic of Nigeria. I wish us all a fruitful deliberations today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adaju, for the welcome address and more or less setting the context for today's session. I would now like to call on Engineer Bilije Madu. He's an engineer at Power Africa and also is a thematic lead for the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, Power Thematic Group under the Industrial Policy Commission. He's going to be speaking to us about the Nigerian electricity sector industry and NESI reforms for linking the energy and manufacturing sectors, what the issues are, the dynamics, and the way forward. Engineer Belije, please.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I could barely hear Shegun speaking, so I hope you can hear me because I could barely make out what Shegun was saying. I don't know, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you. I actually heard Dr. Adaji
Okay,
when he was
so
speaking.
let's go to the next.
You can also speak up.
I should also do what?
Speak up, but I could hear Dr. Adaji, but if you could speak up, then we could hear you
Okay,
better.
I don't know if you can hear me now. Okay, you can hear
Yes,
me
we
better.
can.
Okay, so essentially I'm going to run through the background, and then I will talk through the eras. We have had 3 eras in the last 10, 15 years in the power sector. You know, we'll talk about the privatization, post-privatization, and then the Electricity Act era. And then I'll talk about the critical major challenges, not all the challenges, the critical ones. Then I will now begin to talk about what I think we should do as a way forward. And I'm supposed to do all this in 10 minutes, so I will be moving very, very fast and at a very high level. And then later on, if you want us to drill down, you could call me back on any particular one. So that takes us to our first slide, the next one. So I think this was what Shegun dwelled on a lot. Our current operating capacity, slice it and dice it the way you like, it's between 3,500 and 5,500 megawatts. That is what we have been able to do in the last 10, 15 years. And obviously, this is it's a major underperformance, right? If you want to industrialize, you're talking about 1 megawatt for every 1,000 people. So a country like Nigeria with roughly 220 million or 217 million people, we should be talking about roughly 200 megawatts of electricity day on day. And even if you compare this to what you see on the grid on every day, the demand we see on the grid is approximately 19,000 megawatts. So essentially, the Nigerian power sector is underperforming, has been underperforming historically and even up to so essentially it is, and as Shegun has been pointing out, it is a major hindrance to achieving the objectives. Without a functional electricity industry, you cannot talk about industrialization, right? Neither can you talk about the 1 trillion economy, which is what this current administration has up by 2030. So essentially, electricity, what is it? We need to keep on remembering that this is an economics of scale business. Essentially, that is what we are talking about here. The bigger the power plants, the bigger your number of customers, the cheaper your tariffs will be. It's as simple as that, right? Because Nigerians at the moment, we have electricity from our generators. And looking at the National Bureau of Statistics, the data, as at the end of 2020, we had approximately 45 million generators in Nigeria. So we do have plenty of self-generation. It's just that self-generation comes at a very expensive cost, and you cannot industrialize with self-generation. You can't get very far. You can do your basic things, but self-generation, right, will not get you very far. We have Nigeria essentially, electricity, if we're able to crack it, there's no doubt in anybody's mind that it will be a big lever and a big driver in curing poverty and trying to close the gap, reducing energy costs and reducing the gap, as well as controlling inflation. And what we have brought out here is a map that essentially shows that as with energy poverty, you have increasing poverty across Nigeria. So it's very clear. So the issue to be tackled or to be handled for industrialization vis-a-vis electricity supply is very clear for everybody to see. If you go to the next page, so essentially, what I have tried to do here is to paint a picture of where we are coming from. We had the pre-transitional period that led us to the privatization. And then we did the privatization, and then we had the transitional electricity market. And we are supposed to now get into the medium-term electricity market, and thereafter get into the long-term electricity market. But we are stuck at the transitional electricity market, and essentially post-privatization is due to financial, you would see my subsequent view graphs, is due to financial shortfalls that have been occurring in the market. So you see at this point, at this stage 2, by now Nigeria should have been somewhere in stage 4, and the electricity would have been a facilitator for industrialization. But we are still stuck. We are still stuck at this stage 2. So the question is, how do we get out of this stage 2 that we are stuck into a fully functional electricity market? So if you go to my next, page, so essentially the question is, what are the challenges? It has to be very clear. The macroeconomic climate in the last 10, 12 years has been challenging. Starting from COVID, we went into COVID. Nigeria faced severe crude oil theft, which is our major foreign exchange earner. We have severe foreign exchange fluctuations. And these things have made it difficult for any industry, which is what the Nigerian electricity supply industry, it's a brand new, it's supposed to be a budding industry to stand on its feet. Because for any industry to stand on its feet, essentially you need financial buffers to effectively run your business. And the Nigerian power sector did not even have the chance to develop those financial buffers. And then you have that dovetails into the liquidity issues. We still have market shortfalls due to under-collections, and we have tariff shortfalls due to the tariffs not being cost-reflective tariffs. You have issues of payment. And these have been despite several attempts by CBN, NEC, the World Bank, FGN, to inject liquidity into the market. So we'll talk about this liquidity thing in subsequent ones. The last one was the president trying to address the problem with 4 trillion naira. Then essentially, the third problem is that your market agreements are still not effective. You have gas suppliers doing best endeavor when the gas supplier should be guaranteed gas supply, because the entire thing is built on a value chain. And if you don't have guaranteed gas supply and you have best endeavor and you have collections being under-effective, so essentially you have your market where your agreements are not fully effective and are not respected the way. And on top of all these problems, you have massive infrastructure deficits. So you need local and international infrastructure investments. In fact, the National Integrated Resource Plan indicated that between 2024 and 2030, that's within the next 5 years, Nigeria will be needing roughly $4.3 billion in terms of infrastructure. That's the power sector. And then between 2031 and 2035, we need approximately $25 billion if we are to phase out this generation, self-generation. So you can see that these are critical. These are not all the challenges of the power sector, but these are really critical challenges that the power sector will need to overcome if we are to get the market going, and if we are to go beyond 5,500 megawatts. So if you go to the next page. So the question is, in the midst of all these challenges, how do we proceed? So essentially, my recommendations, I've started discussions here about solution, right? When we start out this reform journey based on a massive amount of promise, right? But we have not encountered what we believed when we set out on the journey we would encounter, right? So we need to go back to the basics. It's very clear. We need to go back to the basics. If you don't go back to the basics, you will keep on making complicated errors upon complicated errors upon complicated errors, and then you're going to be forever at this 3,500, 5,500 megawatt stage. So essentially, the first basic is that power generation is an economics of scale business. It's simple. The bigger your power plant and the bigger your number of customers, the cheaper your tariffs, right? The big power plants we have are gas-fired power plants. So it's a no-brainer that what we should be looking at is expanding those gas-fired power plants, going into combined cycle and additional trains. And this should form the backbone of the Nigerian grid over the medium and long term. This is not a short-term solution. And essentially, it's also not a no-brainer that we have plenty of piped gas in Nigeria, and this should serve as a traditional energy. So anybody who is talking about renewable energy is good, but to make that transition into renewable energy, we still do need gas as a transition energy, right? And the third one is that the amount of money we collect based on the tariffs has to fully cover the cost, right? And there's a limit to what you can. At the moment, we have approximately 12 million paying customers sitting in the NEC database. There's a limit to which you can keep on increasing the amount of money these 12 million people have to pay. Consequently, we need to expand the collection base of our customers. You know, we can't have 45 million generators and we have only 12 million customers. There's a massive disconnect there, and that has to be addressed. And then we have been saying this, FGN and World Bank funding cannot run this industry, even if you look at the integrated resource plan. And the funding should only be used strategically to attract investor funds. You know, federal government of Nigeria using your funds, you cannot give Nigeria the amount of energy we need, going for the amount of electricity we need. So if you go to the next one, as to going back to the basics, we have said this one, if you what's the driver for the carve out of industrial and commercial clusters is that if you look in the last 10 years, industrial and commercial clusters in Nigeria are still being underserved. There's a need to look, if you want to tackle industrialization head on, there's a need to look at a different strategy for supplying electricity to industrial and commercial clusters across Nigeria. If we keep on leaving them on the grid and we keep on approaching them the way we've been approaching them, we're not going to make progress. So similar to what the oil and gas industry, they do for marginal fields, whereby marginal fields are carved out from OMLs and are addressed, a different strategy has to be used for addressing in the short term. In the long term and medium term, industrial and commercial clusters can come back to the grid. But going forward, for us to squarely address industrialization in Nigeria in the short term, we have to start looking at. And essentially, to go with that strategy, you have to start looking at truck gas solutions for those industrial clusters in the short to medium term, right? If you can extend the gas network to these industrial and commercial clusters, beautiful. But if you cannot, like the ones up north, the industrial and commercial clusters up north, you must have to look at virtual gas pipeline, which are gas solutions for the short term. And then the seventh point is that distribution companies are the foundation of the electricity supply chain. If we want to get this grid power right, distribution companies must be financially robust to handle the rigors of the business in a challenging macroeconomic environment like Nigeria. If your distribution companies are not financially robust, then they won't be able to handle it. And the last point, which I believe is clear to everybody, is that the market must be structured to attract local and international investments on a major scale. Different approaches must be considered going forward. Go to the next, if you go to the next. So the recommendations are very clear, which is bringing me to the end of my presentation. The DISCO recapitalization, before we start the next political cycle, is fundamental, noting that most of your DISCOs are technically bankrupt as we speak. And as a minimum, the recapitalization process must raise the required capital for expanding the DISCO network, metering, monitoring, and working capital to ensure that we can get up to 12 gigawatts of electricity distributed across Nigeria. If your DISCOs do not have the working capital, and then to ensure that they drive down their ET and C losses to acceptable levels. If the DISCOs do not have the working capital, then the grid power you have will keep on remaining stuck at 3,500, 5,000 megawatts range. Then all DISCO loans must be converted to Naira. A DISCO still holding the acquisition loan in dollars, it's a big obstacle, and it has to be. And then appropriate haircuts will need to be made. So a strategy for tackling the DISCO acquisition loans will have to be put on the table, and it must be implemented for us to go forward. And the fourth point is the carve out of commercial and industrial clusters, so that they can begin to have 24/7, 365 electricity supply, which is currently not available on the grid. These are the short-term solutions, or the recommendations for the short-term solutions that have been made. Then going to the long-term solutions, if you go to the next one, the medium to long-term, essentially it says that the point being made here is that for you to solve a NESI problem, we must begin to look at institutions, right? The president calling people together and raising 4 trillion naira from the villa, it's a good move, but it will not cure, because the past president raised the first 600 billion naira, did not cure. They raised CBN, raised the second 900 billion naira, still did not cure. So essentially, we must look at institutional methodologies or modalities for solving this problem, and the Power Finance Corporation comes to mind. The Power Finance Corporation, when it is set up, can look at a long-term way for raising long-term green energy funds. And essentially, you're looking at the 3 billion, 5 billion power sector bond range. But it is an institution that will hold this financing, and then that will come into the power sector and begin to play to cure all these deep problems or challenges that we have. And then again, in the long term, we must work with TCN and the NISO to make sure that 12 gigawatts can be wheeled and can be transmitted on the grid. Federal government will have to do that, right? And then we must increase the customer base we have. Like I said previously, 12 million customers cannot carry the tariff for this country. We have to increase the customer base. And then we have to look at the electricity pricing model to make sure we accommodate cost reflective and gas pricing, as well as affordable electricity for Nigerians. And then the fourth point is that contracts must be fully activated. The law demands that we have an industry driven by active contracts. Consequently, those contracts must, and that's the only thing that works in the power industry. All best endeavor gas supply contracts will have to be updated, upgraded to guaranteed contracts. And then we must fully activate 12 to 20 gigawatts of electricity supply, as well as make sure that the funding for the shortfalls that will begin to occur, given our macroeconomic conditions, is taken up by the Power Finance Corporation when we fully activate. I believe that if all these things are done, it will begin to lead to the cure, both in the short term of both on-grid and off-grid electricity in Nigeria. And it will begin to liberate the books of our commercial banks that lent money to the institutions that acquired both DISCOs and GENCOs. And then we'll begin to see liquidity movement in the power sector. And with that liquidity movement, local investors and international investors will again begin to develop an interest. At the moment, the only two entities funding the Nigeria power sector is the federal government and the World Bank. Apart from these two entities, no other person is bringing money into the Nigerian power sector. So this situation will need to be turned if we are to go beyond the 5,500 megawatts glass ceiling that we have imposed on ourselves. I guess that brings me to the end of my and I don't think it took more than 10 minutes. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Jabelide, thank you so much for this, going through the power sector challenges and even the recommendations within such a short time. It's clear now we have a roadmap. It's a political will or a whole suite of issues that need to be taken into consideration for the government to adopt all that you have raised here. I think if we take this kind of roadmap and there's political will and then there's enforcement, implementation backed by the political will, I think we can move forward and get to the promised land of a lighted up Nigeria, especially for the industrial sector. I just want to raise something so that when we start with the panel, Kayode might raise that issue, the issue of trucking the gases trucking gas to industrial clusters in the short term. And what comes to mind is rail. So Kayode, please note that we can discuss that during the panel.
Yeah, but the point I wanted to make is before you now go to transportation mode,
yes,
the market must exist.
Yes.
right? And if you go to there's a company that makes lube oil in Kano that have a very pathetic case. I think they need like 6 megawatts to make their lube oil, and so you can and they run diesel generators. So you can imagine the amount of essentially the owner of the company was telling us that in fact at the moment he runs at less than half capacity, and that very soon, because for him the business can no longer survive. He can't keep on running diesel generators of 3 megawatts, of 2 megawatts, just to keep on making lube oil in Kano. So for places like Kano, Maiduguri, Sokoto, where there are apparently no gas pipeline, and when you have people wanting to set up industries, you have to, your next best bet in the short term is to look at making sure that they have a market, and then having a trucks gas solution via road or via rail, because that's the only way they can begin to reduce their energy costs and still have 24/7 electricity.
Yeah, so that's why I was saying that the issue is, you know, the state of our roads, and then even the roads that are being fixed, the weight of of these trucks would also affect the long-term performance of the roads. So rail, unfortunately, was still behind with with rail. So it's almost like a chicken and egg situation we have. Where do we start from? So I think maybe during the panel session, Kayode will throw some more light on this, but it's an important solution that just have to find a way to kickstart. So, Injabile, do you want to go off now? Because I know you have something else to do, or would you be
I'll
willing
be
to
dropping
take a
off
few
for the next 5
questions?
minutes. Thank you.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we'll note any questions. So if there anyone that has any questions for Engineer Bilije, should please put them in the chat room, or when we have the Q&A, you can ask them. We will collate them and then we'll publish it on the NESG LinkedIn page eventually. So you can always look it up, and you can also put your email so that we can send the responses to you and to everyone anyway. So we're going into the panel session. I'd like to first start with, my apologies, I mentioned at the beginning that this is a 3-part series for the pre-summit for this year's Nigerian Economic Summit. So the first part we held in the Industrial PC. Part 1, it was called the Developing Strategies to Transform Nigeria's Oil and Gas Sector into an Innovation-Driven, Export-Focused Engine of Inclusive Growth, aligning with the Nigeria First policy, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and the Africa Union Agenda 2063. And we held this on Tuesday, August 5th, 2025. So the aim of that was to start to build awareness about the technological and industrial innovations that are taking place in the oil and gas industry. Most people are only aware of extraction. They're also aware of the refining and gas to power, those aspects, the downstream parts. But most people are not aware of the engineering and the manufacturing aspects in the oil and gas sector, enabled by the Nigerian Oil Content Act, as well as the Cabotage Act and the Petroleum Industry Act. So the reforms that we're pursuing through this advocacy is for the government to accelerate the industrialization taking place in the oil and gas sector, so that the industry can be transformed into Nigeria's industrial base, no longer just the revenue base, but also as the industrial base. And the second part was, the part 2 of the series was leveraging Nigeria's agricultural, mining, iron and steel, and maritime resources to drive industrialization and economic diversification by replicating the governance, local content reforms, and engineering and technological capabilities being developed in the oil and gas sector across these other resource-based sectors. So this strategy in both sessions that we discussed is known as the resource-based industrialization industrial policy approach, which the Nordic countries like Norway, Sweden, and Finland have adopted, transforming them from low-tech to high-tech industrialized economies. So we held the second session on Thursday, August 22nd, 2025, and today's session now talks about the enablers to industrialization. So we've just heard from Engineer Bilije talk about, take us through one of the biggest challenges to Nigeria's industrialization, which is power. So again, we're talking about industrialization, the two parts of industrialization. There's the part where you convert your raw materials into processed and finished goods. And there's the other part where you leverage your natural resources to start manufacturing the equipments, the technologies, and the inputs to process and beneficiate your raw materials in the country so that you reduce your dependency on imported machinery, equipment, technologies for your industrial sector. So thank you. So now we're going to move into the panel session. Give me a few seconds. I will read through the brief profiles of our three panelists. The first panelist is Mr. Catalysing. He is the principal partner at Infrastructure Delivery International. He has over 30 years of experience in public-private partnerships, privatization and transport. He's worked in the UK. He's actually a lawyer, worked at Simmons & Simmons in London before serving as a consultant in Nigeria's Bureau of Public Enterprises, advising on ports and rail concessions and leading PPP legislative reforms. He's also worked with the UK Nigeria Infrastructure Advisory Facility in 2008 as a transport sector coordinator, overseeing several federal and state projects for the Infrastructure Concession Regulatory Commission and other aspects. He's also led the Future Cities Nigeria program, working on PPP structures in Lagos and Ogun State, and most recently advised the Ministry of Mines and Steel Development on a project for supporting mining and steel growth along the Central Economic Corridor. Thank you, Kade, for accepting to join the panel. Next person, please. We also have on the panel Dr. Segun Adaju. Dr. Adaju is a fellow of the, sorry, I don't know what the AES is, but he's also a member of the Institute of Directors. He's a chief energizing officer of Consistent Energy Limited, where he provides off-grid solar power solutions for small businesses. He has a rich and broad background as a consultant, managing high-impact projects funded by DFID, Development Bank of Nigeria, Bank of Industry, the EU, GIZ, the Africa Development Bank, UNDP, USAID, World Bank, focusing on market research, energy access, and energy efficiency. He holds a BSc in economics and an MBA from University of Lagos, alongside executive education from Harvard Business School, MIT Sloan, Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. And he's a former president of the Renewable Energy Association of Nigeria. And as I mentioned earlier, he currently serves on the steering committee of the Industrial Policy Commission, which is the main host of today's event. Thank you. Next, we also have Mr. Ibigbere Clark, who is a senior investment and advisory professional with over 20 years experience at the intersection of energy, climate finance, and infrastructure development across Africa. He currently leads Frontier Alpha LLP, advising governments, multilaterals, and private sector partners on sustainable energy policy, project design, and capital raising strategies. Previously served as advisor to the managing director of InfraCorp, and also as a special advisor to the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, where he championed programs on solar power Nigeria, and the Nigeria Energy Market Stabilization Facility. He is also headed performance management of Nigeria's power sector privatization and has structured billions of dollars in clean energy and infrastructure financing. He is an engineer with a degree from the University of Cambridge and is a visiting fellow with the Africa Policy Research Institute, APRI, focusing on climate finance, country platform structuring, and digital infrastructure policy. So we have a very rich panel. Just want to say that we had a few ladies as well on the panel we had invited, but unfortunately they couldn't make it because the clash with their schedules. So we'll go right into the panel. I'll start with Kayode in order of presentation of your profiles. Kayode, so I'd like to focus on, I know you've been at this on this real reform since about 2000. So you're a veteran, and unfortunately, we still don't have, we're not yet at the promised land in terms of rail transportation to support industrial growth or even passenger movement. So along the different rail routes, Nigeria's Central Corridor holds huge potential through projects like the uncompleted and unoperational Central Railway, which cuts across Delta, Edo State, if I'm not mistaken, the FCT, Niger State, Kaduna State, Kano State, and of course, Kogi State. The Central Corridor also holds the Ajakuta Steel Complex, which is still not operational, and the National Iron Ore Mining Company, NIOMCO. It also holds the Delta Steel Alaja Company, now known as Premium Steel. The question I have for you is, how would integrated reforms such as concessioning the Central Rail Line, the steel complex, the NIOMCO mines, reviving the steel industry, reviving iron ore mining, and then adopting a local content policy, as well as integrating different other policies, financial policies, and other infrastructure policies, energy policy, and so on. How would that help to transform the steel industry to becoming a key industrial base for Nigeria? If you could take 5 minutes to answer this, I'll be truly grateful. I know it's a long one, so 5 minutes is cutting it.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Amanda, and it's very nice to obviously meet with you again. Look, this is a very, very complex area, and I think it's almost impossible to try and summarize it in 5 minutes, but I'll do my best. Now, the first transaction that I was involved in was actually the Central Railway, when we actually concessioned it to Global Infrastructure as far back as 2006. At the time, it was our pioneer rail concessioning program when the federal government was keen to actually drive private sector participation in rail. At the same time, we were approached by the Mittal Group, who wanted to take over the concession of Ajakuta, and they also wanted to take over the concession of NIOMCO. These three integrated projects were actually initially constructed by the Federal Ministry of Power and Steel way back in the 1980s. But obviously, once it had been split up into transport, rail, and mining, and then the Central Rail project was actually carved out of that project and was seen as a separate transaction. I was a project manager for the rail concession. So the integration and the survival of that Central Railway is intimately linked to the survival of to the resuscitation of Ajakuta Steel and NIOMCO. Unfortunately, or actually fortunately for us, we actually concessioned both Ajakuta and also NIOMCO to the GINL. But unfortunately for us, all those particular transactions are now stuck in the legal system, and we only have the Central Railway there, whilst, there's an injunction by the Kogi state government, at least the last I heard of it, preventing the federal government from actually concessioning these two assets. However, critical to us is Ajapita and Nyonko. We can't do anything in the mining sector, as far as I'm concerned, until when those two particular plants are actually revived. The issue with Ajapita now is not just the concession of the plant itself, but where do we get the feedstock from in terms of the coking coal to actually run Ajapita steel mill itself? The iron ore is very close there in Nyonko, but the issue, the initial plan was to actually import the coking coal, and that was obviously at the time when our naira was very strong, and then obviously use the coking coal blended with the iron ore to produce the steel. Now that the coking coal is no longer available, we now need to source coal from other areas. And part of our Mindiver project, one of the first things we decided to do was to set up an interministerial committee. This interministerial committee is absolutely vital because you have various ministries working in silos and not working together, and they're all involved in various assets that are integrated. So you have the Ministry of Mines, you have the Ministry of Steel, and you also have the Ministry of Transportation and also Power, who are meant to be intricately linked due to the gas links to Ajapita and also the power plants at Ajapita as well. So without that interministerial committee where they meet regularly to plan the future of the iron and ore steel industry, together with the railways, I see it as incredibly difficult for us to achieve what we want to achieve. So that's the first step in terms of setting up the industry framework to ensure this thing works. The second thing we need to bring into the play is actually the NCP, Bureau of Public Enterprise, the National Council of Privatization, working with the ICRC, all of them together to ensure again that the federal government is on the same page with regards to the concession of these assets and also the oversee of these assets. Without this whole institutional and policy framework in place as your first step, it will be very difficult for anyone to jump into the concession of these assets. So, however, if we now look at the coal problem, where do we get the coking coal from? Where do we get the appropriate coal from? People are now looking and actually converting Ajapita from a blast furnace. Sorry, man, I'm not a mining expert. I'm more in rail, but obviously since I've been involved in this sector, I do have some idea as to how these things work. They're now talking about electric arc furnace. So we're now looking at converting Ajapita from the blast furnace to an electric arc furnace. And I see some hope in actually trying to resuscitate that plant because we seriously doubt that there is sufficient political will to actually get the coal to Ajapita to mix it to the iron ore to produce the steel industry. So I think due to the shortage of time, that's the only high-level explanation I can give now within the 5-minute time frame. But please, if you need any specific answers to any specific questions, I'm obviously available to address them. Once we obviously finally, I'll actually talk about financing. Once you actually do the viability assessment of these assets, and once you determine they're viable, then it's easy right now to find the private sector who are willing to actually invest in these plants, supported by the federal government in areas where it will be pretty awkward for the private sector to get into that investment. So we need a blended form of investment from the federal government and the private sector to ensure that these three major assets come into stream. Once they come into stream, all the other mining in the area will all be realized along this actual spine. But until then, I see it very difficult for us to actually resuscitate the railway line without these two major legacy assets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kade. Very difficult issues to summarize it in 5 minutes, but I'll come back to you with other questions, particularly related to rail. So I'll now go on to Dr. Adaju. So you listened to Dr. Bilije take us through the challenges with the power sector and then his roadmap with short-term and medium to long-term recommendations, which in my opinion seemed, quite simple and easy to do if I don't know if the government is aware of these kind of recommendations and then, take a synchronized approach towards implementing them. But how urgent really is it? Well, it's a no-brainer, it's urgent. So, but I'll still ask the question, how urgent is it to address the power sector deficit to deliver the Nigeria First policy and transform Nigeria into a high-tech industrialized economy where we're processing and beneficiating our natural resources for our industries, and we're also manufacturing the domestic capital goods to enable us to process and beneficiate the natural resources, thereby reducing our dependency on foreign capital goods and inputs. And then how would you relate all this to Engineer Bilije's roadmap? And how do we maybe do you think it's a case of the government trying to reform the power sector for everyone, for the commercial, for the industrial, for the consumers, and not a case of taking a sectoral approach? Maybe if it adopts it from this Nigeria First, or from the perspective of trying to industrialize the economy, like having a specific target, do you think that would help to change the government's approach towards power sector reforms? Because maybe this trying to provide power for everyone is probably not getting us to, you're not getting us anywhere.
Thank you so much. Let me start with the last question, and very brief, because I think it's very compelling to quickly respond to that. I think for me, it's a situation of, liking to someone who's trying to please everyone, and then trying to balance a solution that will fit, everyone. Agreed. I mean, power for all, energy access, for all by 2030 or whatever year we agree, is very important and relevant. But we need to identify the urgent, just like Engineer Biliji has broken it down to, short-term, medium, and long-term approaches. We need to identify what is pretty very urgent that can now take us to the ultimate objective of power for everyone. And that brings me to, also the first question: how urgent is it? It is existentially urgent. It is. I don't know how urgent I can say the urgency is. It's very urgent that we address the power sector deficit in Nigeria. If we must attempt to achieve the Nigeria First industrial policy, power is one of the major constraints to industrial development and growth in Nigeria, to competitiveness, to productivity, and virtually every sector how is feeling, feels this deficiency. So how urgent is pretty very urgent. Now it is the why that probably we should focus on. If we must become a high-tech resource processing manufacturing economy, how? I mean, what's the why? Number one is the number one binding constraint on growth and competitiveness. We talked about that. You can see what the contribution to GDP from manufacturing is. And also, by World Bank estimates, over 85 million people don't have access to electricity. So that alone is a huge constraint. It's also urgent because there's this shortfall in global standards. Engineer Biliji talks about 1 megawatt for 1,000 people. So that means currently we should be, if we must be competitive with developed economies, we must be at the range of 200,000 megawatts. Of course, that would be a big leap. So where do we even start from? Okay, so those are the points. Then he also mentioned the fact that energy is cheaper if you produce at large scale. Most of the manufacturing sectors, if you speak to manufacturers as young Nigeria, many of them are self-generating, and the cost is pretty very high, averaging about 44 US cents per kilowatt hour, pretty very high. And there are evidences and proofs that, yeah, Nigerians can actually pay for the power, especially for productive activities. That has been my experience also working with, SMEs doing commercial and industrial solar, for example. If it's used for productivity, then it creates revenue, creates income, increases the willingness and ability to pay, and then it's a win-win for everyone. One of the whys is also that there's a huge dependency on generators. I mean, we don't have to, belabor that factor. And creating this mounting fiscal and sector liquidity pressures. We hear every year what government is spending to subsidize tariff. I think Nigeria also needs to be very bold to say, look, what do we want to achieve? Industrialization. How do we ensure power, investment comes into power? We must adopt a cost-reflective tariff that will encourage investment. I know it's pretty very hard to say, okay, you want to please everyone. There are some very rural communities where maybe ability and probably willingness to pay is reduced. There could be schemes that can, support such communities and such beneficiaries. But really, the urgency is that we need power to industrialize. We need to enhance investment in the sector by creating incentives for investments to come in. We need to resolve the liquidity challenges in the sector, and it's of course through a cost-reflective tariff that I think this should be done. Then policy window is also open. Our power is key, and if we put this in place, I think we will be able to move towards achieving this industrialization that we're looking at. And of course, according to Billy, and also that was also what I wanted to speak about, we need to partition it into what's the quick win, what's the urgent that we can do in the short term, the medium term, and the long term to achieve this. One of the areas we need to look at is also the transmission infrastructure, and that also costs money. That requires money. How do we pull money into enhancing the infrastructure? For example, if we generate, I think so, I mean, I can be corrected. If we generate 5,000 megawatts today, how effective are we able to transmit, distribute, and also effectively collect revenue? Okay, so those are some of those whys why we need to urgently look at the power space and how we can effectively generate electricity for productivity and in the long run enhance competitiveness of the Nigerian manufacturing sector. If there are other questions as we make progress, I'll be very happy to also take them up. Thank you. Over to you.
Dr. Adaju, thank you so much. Sorry, excuse me, I have a cold. And really, I like the way you framed it, that I think we need to go back to this issue of why. Maybe that will help reorientate even our policy decision makers if they start from the why. So we even have a Nigeria First policy. So there is a compelling why to change the structure and the way that we're trying to reform the sector. And I think from the insights from you and Engineer Bilije that it is possible, and starting from why. And why is that we need to industrialize, and it will filter down once we focus on this big issue of Nigeria needs to industrialize. You said something about how do we, it'll be a big leap to become competitive compared with more developed countries that have addressed their power. In fact, power is not an issue at all. But I'll take you back to Africa. The Africa Industrialization Index, published by the Africa Development Bank, ranked Nigeria 8th out of 52 African countries. So on the continent, out of 52 African countries, we're the 8th most industrialized nation. But globally, we are down, very down the ladder. But within the African country, amongst the first top 10, countries like South Africa, although South Africa has huge energy challenges, Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco are on the higher scale. And in fact, among the North African countries, Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco are leading in terms of being one of the most industrialized, among the most industrialized nations. And the binding factor among the North African countries is power, infrastructure, and consistency of regulations, better enabling environment for industrialization. So these countries are already manufacturing medium to high tech. They're on the road to medium to high tech manufacturing, while Nigeria is still at the low tech manufacturing segment. So just hold this and I'll come back to you afterwards on how do you think, instead of even benchmarking ourselves against the more industrialized countries, how do we even start with our neighbors within within North Africa? So I'll come back. So that will be the next round of questions and I'll ask you. So I'll go now to Mr. Bipere Clark. Bipere, are you smiling?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, but I said, are you smiling?
I'm always smiling, just it's not always visible.
Okay. I thought, well, also because you're also in the power sector, so you're smiling because this is a long journey that.
Power sector now. I've left the power sector.
Okay, all right. So yeah, that's why you're smiling, because you're happier now. Okay, so the question I'm asking though really is around financing. We have weak infrastructure. Both speakers Dr. Madu and Dr. Daju just talked about, Engineer Madu and Dr. Daju just talked about the transmission, the transition network and the level of infrastructure that needs to be poured into developing the infrastructure. And then also within the distribution sector, the metering and so on. So that requires huge infrastructure. We've just talked about rail with Kayode. And so maybe we could also put in ports. So there's huge infrastructure deficit gap. How do we finance that? What bold steps would you propose for building an industrial financing ecosystem? So again, I think Nigeria tries to do everything, energy for all, infrastructure for all, financing for all. How do we create an ecosystem that focuses on what we really need now, that would then unlock the fundamentals that would address poverty? So really, how do we have an ecosystem focused on industrialization, knowing that industrialization, particularly from the perspective of these sustainable development goals, is that particular goal that can unlock all the other SDGs. And in this case, sorry, Ibipere, so in this case, we're talking about an industrial financing ecosystem that unlocks research, development, innovation, as well as infrastructure financing to support manufacturing growth, and infrastructure development in the country.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda.
Okay, yeah.
I would first of all like to say something that I always say typically. You rarely have a financing problem. What you have is an economics problem, and you have to differentiate that. If the economics dictates that you're not likely to make money, you're going to find it very hard to attract finance. And let me just give you an example. Billy J said something very interesting, which is essentially only the government finances the power sector. But you need to look beyond the power sector, and let's just look at the banking sector and compare it to South Africa. And I think it's very important that people understand what I call the dimension of the economy that we operate in before they start making assertions as to what they believe we can do. The entire Nigerian banking sector roughly is 13% of GDP. The South African banking sector is about 130% of GDP. So if I was to get all the banks in Nigeria, they wouldn't make a top 5 of the South African banks, okay? So the question you're trying to ask now is, what can the Nigerian banking sector do? You can say the same thing of the capital markets. So even if you were to say the Nigerian economy and the South African economy were the same, which they're not, but they're roughly the same, our banking sector and our capital markets are 1/10 the size. So they can do 1/10 of what South Africa could do from capitalization. So clearly, if we want to do more, we need a bigger banking sector. But now you have to look at what the banking sector is doing. At the current moment, what the banking sector is doing is they're lending to government more than they're lending to the power sector, to the private sector. So we have this issue that we have a public sector dominated economy, whether it's what the real economy is doing or what the financial sector is doing. The focus is on, not on a private sector-led economy, but on the government, okay? So given that we have the banking sector increasing credit to the government more than they're doing to the private sector, why isn't the private sector out there? The reason the private sector isn't out there is because there's a productivity issue. Part of that productivity issue is power and the ability to add value added efficiently and effectively. And if you were to go to the bankers and you were to ask a very simple question, would you rather lend me money to produce rice in Nigeria, or would you rather lend me money to import it? Every single banker would say, I'd prefer to give you money to import it. So we have this sort of circular problem. And that's why, you know, as Kayode said, it's very complex to say. You do have to try to break it somewhere. If you want to break it sufficiently, then you need to have economic reform. You need to, first of all, have a focus that the economy has to be more private sector driven than public sector driven. If it is more private sector driven, that is going to be the only way you are going to drive increase in banking assets to the private sector and increase the size of the banking sector. So it is all well and good saying, how do we create this banking ecosystem? But you create it by creating the environments for banks and capital markets to lend, which is economic reform to allow the private sector to operate. And then once again, we're back into this loop of, oh, but power is so expensive. So we have to understand that what we have to do has to make economic sense for people to finance. And it seems that we don't understand that in the power sector, which is why the government is stepping in and is the only financier of the power sector. That is having an input and a problem on the private sector overall in the economy, and that is having an input on the growth of the banking sector within the economy. So it's all very much related. The financial sector, the banking sector can do more, but there needs to be the economic design that allows the private sector to make money, and in order to make money, to borrow money. And right now, that isn't there. Now, yes, I think the way to go about that is to somehow create some sort of zoning system, because clearly this is going to be too hard to do at, and probably too politically hard to do at a national level. But until and unless we create these zones of economic competence, it's going to be really hard to break this sort of a vicious cycle that we have ourselves in, which is the only person to dominate the delivery of goods and services in the economy ends up being the government, and it therefore ends up not being an economic situation. which means it ends up not being financeable, which means everyone backs away, including the financial sector, from the development of the economy. It's a very circular problem. And I know everyone would say, oh, we need more money, but the issue isn't needing more money. The issue is creating the incentives for the economics to attract the finance. And once that is done, the circle stops going in the wrong direction, freezes, and goes in the other direction to produce economic development.
Okay, so I'll come back to you with this question around, even if the federal government succeeds in redesigning the structure where it basically leaves the market to the private sector to drive, and starting even with the power sector, as others have mentioned. How do we tackle the issue at the state level, where state governments are the private sector? They are setting up beer factories, they are setting up fruit processing factories. They're basically investing in the productive sector rather than creating enabling environments for private investors to come in. So we'll come back to you on this. So please just think it through. So I'll go back to Kayode, and this will be the last round before we take in a few minutes for Q&A. Kayode, so I don't know if you remember when Engineer Bilije talked about trucking gas to industrial clusters, particularly those that are far away from the gas producing areas. So for instance, in Kano, without rail, how effective would this be? And then what can Nigeria also do to accelerate rail sector development? You started this journey, as I mentioned earlier, about 25 years ago. So I'm not talking about the corridor, steel corridor now. Rail sector, how do we, what can be done to solve that, to support the industrialization drive?
Thank you for that question, Amanda. I think that one of the saddest things about our Nigerian rail sector is somebody somewhere, I don't know who, I don't know where, convinced Nigeria that we didn't need the narrow gauge system. Since when that decision has been made, our whole rail sector strategy has been completely destroyed.
Kayode, sorry, please explain. Kayode, sorry to interrupt you. Please explain what the narrow gauge is.
Yeah,
Remember,
I was just about to say that. I was now.
Okay.
Now, sorry, man, I haven't got the exact width numbers, but the narrow gauge basically is a narrower gauge than what we call the standard gauge, which is a wider gauge. Okay. During the colonial period, the British government brought narrow gauge not just to Africa, but to South America and also to Australia. Today, the very industrial nations of Australia and South Africa use narrow gauge very, very effectively. The longest and heaviest trains in the world, the train records now, is split between South Africa and Australia. 1 year, South Africa defeats it. Another year, Australia defeats it. These are highly industrialized nations. And not once over the last 100 years have these nations ever considered about tearing up the existing system to implement a new gauge. I think the only way I can explain it to non-technical people is when we had our former national stadium in Nigeria. We abandoned the national stadium in Lagos. We built the Abuja stadium because we wanted a newer stadium. Where is the Abuja stadium now? Abandoned. So it's got nothing to do with the assets. It has to do with your maintenance and upgrade of that particular asset. We have failed to maintain and upgrade our narrow gauge system. So everybody now assumes that we need standard gauge. What Nigeria needs, and what I think I've said it till I'm blue in the face, I've actually given up now, is we need to start to learn how to move 20 to 40 trains a day. And when I'm talking 20 to 40 trains a day, I'm not referring to the loss-making passenger trains, because passenger trains, long distance, don't make any money. Even America, the most privatized industrial nations, Amtrak is run by the state government, by the American government, because no private sector company would subsidize long distance passenger train operations. So all of Africa, all rail concessions are basically freight-based concessions. This goes back to your question about using rail to transfer the products that you were referring to earlier on. So to repair the backlog maintenance of the existing narrow gauge, when you hear the word maintenance, you don't see Nigerians around that day, we disappear. To do backlog maintenance for the existing narrow gauge, the last time we looked at it was estimated at $800 million. That is 3,000 kilometers of narrow gauge line. To construct the Lagos-Ibadan standard gauge line has cost us $1.5 billion. Now, this is a very fine point I'd like to make now. When you compare the narrow gauge line from Lagos to Ibadan alone, that narrow gauge line goes into major industrial centers in Ikeja, in Ogun State. By the time you go to Kwara, by the time you go up north, most of the factories in the north have what we call sidings going into those various factories. Yeah. The length of the sidings is probably as long as the existing 3,000 kilometers of narrow gauge railway. So even though you're building a railway from Lagos to Ibadan, where everybody's celebrating loss-making passenger trains, which are not sustainable, you build huge stations, you build all those things, all loss-making, all loss, wasting a lot of money building these things. We haven't even started building the sidings to the various factories along the routes that require to move that freight. So our whole rail strategy now is one complete disaster. We have standard gauge railways here, we have narrow gauge railways here. And to my shock and horror, I'm sorry, you know me, I'm always very critical. I stay my mind. I opened the papers last week. We're now moving to $60 billion high-speed rail link from Lagos to Abuja. Our standard gauge passenger trains from Abuja to Kaduna, loss-making, may I add, we can't sustain it, got derailed the other day. Yeah? So people don't understand that if you're building a high-speed, loss-making passenger train service from Abuja to Lagos, you'll have to cordon off that corridor. You can't even allow a piece of stone on the track all the way from Abuja to Kaduna. So unless somebody in this government really sits down and begins to reassess this whole standard narrow gauge debate and makes a definitive decision to stick to the narrow gauge, the Lagos to Ibadan standard gauge is not at a loss, because don't forget, the Central Railway is standard gauge. We can always turn right. Instead of going all the way to Kano, Kaduna on standard gauge, we can always turn right at Ibadan, go through Benin, go through Agbo, that's where the Central Railway is, and actually connect it all the way to Enugu, because that's the plan, to have an east-west rail link crossing the Central Line standard gauge. And I think that is where our standard gauge expansion should end, and we should just focus on the concession and rehabilitation of that narrow gauge network. There's several international firms Because if you recall, when I was at the BP, we had the EOI adverts for the rail concessions. Nigeria received the highest rail responses because we had just successfully completed our port concessions, which was a huge success, and the whole world was looking to Nigeria. And what do you connect the ports with? The narrow gauge rail goes all the way to all the ports in Nigeria, Apapa Port and also Port Harcourt Port. So they were waiting for Nigeria to conclude the concession of these narrow gauge networks so we can start to move the tremendous amount of freight that gets clogged up at our ports, that destroys our roads. We spend billions rehabilitating these roads and cause innumerable damage and loss of life on our nation's roads. So somebody really has to sit down and sort that out. Now, can I just divert just a little bit? When we're working on the Vision 2020 program and also on the medium-term national development plan, this is where this billion-dollar requirement Nigeria needs for power, Nigeria needs for railways. We started off asking all the MDAs to bring all their projects. So they listed all their projects, which went into billions of dollars. And I told them, I said, look, now we have the projects. What we now have to do is rank these projects based on priority and rank these projects based on budget availability. Because if anybody tells me today that Nigeria needs $10 billion a year for the power sector, and you're expecting the private sector to bring in through PPP and concessions $8 billion, the whole world already know we don't know what we're talking about. Because how much money do we have in our national budget that is available for capital expenditure? Even at that, can the private sector, do we have the capacity, do we have the understanding, do we have the funding to fund the remaining billions of dollars required to fulfill this sector? So somebody really needs to sit down. The Great Wall of China was built over a 300-year period. Somebody needs to sit down and say, based on the budget availability, I don't care whether you think you need $10 billion for power, I don't care whether you need $5 billion for metering, how much do we think the private sector realistically can fund? And how much do you think the government can fund? And based on those realistic targets, you eventually have a plan. What we produce in on our national integrated master plan, in our national development plan, unfortunately, Vision 2020, we started that process, but we ran out of money. We obviously couldn't rank the projects. That's where this money came from. We put all the money in a pot and it moved its way. National Vision 2020, it moved into National Integrated Master Plan, and people are just carrying these figures forward. I don't see that as a plan. I see it as a wish list. And until when we start to sit down, as what Eddie Clark was saying, and ensure that we have the right opportunities and the right programs to fund these projects, we will continue to go around in circles, claiming Nigeria needs $3-4 trillion a year for its infrastructure deficit. To me, that doesn't make sense because we have never spent $3 trillion a year on infrastructure. I don't even think we've spent $3 billion a year on infrastructure. So we need to sit down and get to that realistic target. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for taking us through that that history. And I saw that we have Sadia Ali, who is the facilitator for infrastructure in the Nigeria Economic Summit Group in our participant list. So I'm happy that she's been here to listen to this as well. So I'll go back to Dr. Adaju, if you could take us through. I know Kaude, I should have stopped him, but I thought it was I thought it was very important, you know, what he was saying. I've heard it quite a number of times, but I thought it was important particularly because I saw Sadia here. So Dr. Adaju, if you could take us briefly through that question that I asked you, that would also help. Thank you.
Okay, if you don't mind, you want to refresh again?
And that is the problem that
Okay.
I can't remember
Okay,
the
yeah, I think I took some
question.
notes. Yes. Okay, so let me talk about, what can we do really? I think, the essence of this engagement is to look at what should we do from here? What are the takeaways? What are the action steps that we need to, what are the recommendations, okay, rather than talk about the problems. For me, we've agreed that we need a base load of power for industrialization. This is also, reflected in, if you compare our economy with economies in North Africa, and also let me say Southern Africa, particularly South Africa, there's a very strong correlation between.
Dr. Adajo actually said North Africa.
Yes, yes,
South
yes.
Africa, I think it's their renewable energy that is helping to bridge the gap, but they're still having challenge with their coal-fired power plant. So it was, what can we take from the North African countries, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, who are all moving towards high-tech manufacturing and are said to have more sophisticated power sector infrastructure and systems that Nigeria has. Thanks for that reminder.
Okay, so yes, taking very good lessons from North Africa, and like I said, there's a strong correlation between level of industrialization and power. Okay, so power in countries that are industrialized, they have very strong power sector and infrastructure. So North Africa, the lessons we need to take from them, for example, there should be diversification of energy sources, and I think Nigeria is also considering that. But we need to look at what our competitive advantage or comparative advantage, let me use that word. What do we have comparatively that we can build that base load? Because for industrialization, there's a base load power that is required. I'm into renewables. I'm a renewable energy enthusiast, but I do agree, and Engineer Bilije mentioned this. There is a transition that is required. So what are the resources that we have now? We have excessive gas reserves. I think it's about 210 trillion cubic feet of reserve as at present. Even our power structure is 80% thermal and 20% large hydro. So how do we ensure the availability of gas and creating adequate contracts, enforceable laws that will make available gas to pipelines, and generating companies, improvements, right? So that's one. For North Africa, I know most of these countries, I've been to a power plant in Morocco, a concentrated solar power where a lot of, solar system is generating energy, okay? So we need to look at what are our competitive advantage, and gas is currently the transition fuel for Nigeria. Of course, it's transiting us into other resources, okay, that we can deploy. And invariably, even renewables, solar and wind, the unit cost also will drop if we have that base load. For example, there are some companies manufacturing and assembling solar panels in Nigeria. If you want to produce or manufacture solar panels in Nigeria, you need a base load of power to do that. So that's number one. Also, I think we need to look at how do we fast track, and there are provisions already in NEC, eligible customer regulations framework. How do we implement and create a fast processing to unlock brief projects? So willing buyer, willing seller, kind of willing access that will enable, third party to generate power and will through the network under transparent and quick, procedures and standard contracts. That will also enable IPPs, captive power, to come to play. I mean, the typical example is, I think it's about power, right? We see what the possibility is to generate power and ring fence into a community or an industrial complex, and creates access that will also empower industrialization. Then, okay, so talking about ring fence also, I mean, if it's possible to also create industrial zones and industrial feeders, possibility of green energy zones is also what we can look at, and with dedicated transmission capacity. And in places like Aba, Ogun, Lekki, Kaduna, Kano, Jos, creating industrial zones and also enabling power access will also help industrialization. And this is what some of these countries also have done. In terms of gas, and at times it's surprising that despite the huge gas reserves that we have, what are the issues? Why can't we have gas to power plants? Why do we have capacity of about 15,000 megawatts and then we can't generate more than 5,000? We have reserve of what I've mentioned in trillion cubic feet of reserves of gas, and we can't get gas to power plants. I mean, it's really a dilemma. And so how do we create enforceable, bankable gas to power contracts, aggregation of gas, and then, appropriate pricing. Also, so availability and payment security will help into create that, gas availability, and then ultimately increase energy access. Of course, we talked about cost-effective tariff. I mean, North African countries, maybe we should compare their pricing per dollar per kilowatt hour to what we generate in Nigeria. And we keep saying that, look, government needs to have that political will to allow cost-effective tariff. That is one of the reasons why most companies, most gencos, and probably discos, having issues of illiquidity and almost declaring. I mean, if I own one of them, probably I will have declared force majeure. I mean, if you have been owed in trillions of naira and subsidies are paid, how do you continue to invest? Right. So, and then permitting industrial complexes to also generate their power. There was a question on the platform talking about why manufacturers, why are they not generating their power instead of complaining about power, really? Yes, agreed. I mean, if there are industrial complexes and there's collective ownership of power plants, that makes public cost reflective. But if each individual industry will have to generate their own power, which they are currently doing, although using generators, it's much, much more expensive. Basically, these are areas that I think if we put actions into force, we're able to begin to compare with North African countries, and then really the Nigerian first strategy will begin to come into place. I mean, if you're asking me as a business person to buy Nigeria, just like Clark mentioned, if it's cheaper if a bank thinks it's better to finance importation than to finance local manufacturing because they're not sure of the unit cost, they're not sure of the viability of your manufacturing plants, they're not sure of the revenue generation and then payback of their loan. They would rather focus on financing importation. And that's what Nigeria, that's the dilemma for Nigeria, perpetually importing what ordinarily we should be able to produce. And one of the major constraints is lack of power for the base load to industrialize. I hope this suffices, and I'll be happy to also provide any other further clarification after.
Thank you, Dr. Daji, for those answers. And in fact, we'll do a lot more work with you on this, looking into the North African power sector. They could do more work on it after this event to understand better, and then that would also inform our policy engagement with the government. So I'll now go lastly to Ebi Pere. There's a question I asked him about. So If he says the problem really is about the economic design, where we seem to be running a public-driven economy rather than a private sector-driven economy. And my question to you was, if we're able to kind of get the government to, particularly, I think it's maybe you see that more in the power sector at the federal level, but at the state level, what you find is a lot of state governments investing directly in industrial activities or setting up manufacturing facilities. So how, under this kind of federal structure, how do we drive that kind of economic redesign that so I think the problem even started from the privatization program in the 2000s. The state governments did not adopt it. So it was a PDP party program, but it didn't filter to the states.
Okay, this is getting a little bit political. Can you hear me? But I'd like.
Yeah, I mean, you can do it without being political. So if I was political, you can.
I'm going to say you need to look at two examples. The
Yeah.
first one is the USA. Let's imagine Shegun and his green technology were in the USA, and he had 20 years, he wanted to do manufacturing. What he would have done is that he would have been under policy whiplash from Obama to Trump to Biden to Trump. You see what I'm trying to say? The issues that we have, policy switchback, occur everywhere. And what you're seeing in America now is that people who want to do, say, green tech manufacturing are wondering, does it make sense to do green tech manufacturing if you cannot predict that in 4 years' time, there is going to be a switch in government, okay? So once you have a political economy that has a certain amount of policy volatility, there's nothing, and people are going to stay away. America has no issue with raising finance, but it does have issue with whether that finance is going to be raised, deployed, and implemented within a 4-year period. Now, look at the other extreme. And it's very interesting to look at this because the very same issues that Nigeria is having from going from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy is what you're seeing in the G7 in going from an industrial economy, one that runs on hydrocarbons, to one that essentially runs on electricity. It's the same problem. And the issue that you are seeing is that the political classes are the ones creating the policy volatility to prevent the transition, okay? So where is the transition working well? You give example of North Africa. They're not democracies. Let's be simple. It's working well in China. Because in an autocracy, strangely enough, and I don't want to get too political, you will get that policy consistency longer than the business cycle, okay? And if you have that policy consistency longer than the 4 to 5 year business cycle, it makes sense to invest. So I'm not saying who to vote for, who not to vote for. I'm saying that if you are in a certain political economy, you are going to find certain decisions hard to make, which would impact the investment you make. So how does China do this? I'm not a Chinese expert, but the one thing that China does do is that they have economic federalism. Are you aware? Where they actually have massive competitions between their region. So the central government just gives a direction, a policy direction, and literally the states are competing with each other. So this massive growth that you are seeing in China is basically being driven by centrally directed policy and regional competition. That's why they have 100 EV companies, because every little area wants to create an EV company. Don't get me wrong, those EV companies are all going to go bankrupt, and then you're going to get 5 large EV companies and they're going to consolidate. But it has a mechanism of creation. We don't have a mechanism of creation, okay? We have the mechanism that Abuja sits in the middle, rather like Brussels, having a whole bunch of areas that basically don't do anything, but Abuja makes all the commands. So I'm not going to say what the solution is. I'm just going to say, look around the world. There's enough examples of where this is working and where this is not working. And I'm not going to be the one that says what Nigeria should do. But it should be pretty obvious what we do need to do. And it's all about incentives. The states have no incentives to do the right things. And until they have the incentives to do the right things, they're not going to do the right things. This isn't actually hard. It's very much like dieting. It's a very simple formula, but it's very hard to have the psychology to do it. We do not yet have the psychology for the transition we're asking ourselves to do. It's as simple as that. We need to get it, and how we get it, but while we have this sort of political flip-flop where every 8 years we go to a region of the country that's more market-oriented, and every 8 years we go to another region of the country that's more government-oriented, then you're going to have it very hard to create that sustainability of policy to ask someone from outside the country or inside the country to invest in a 30-year infrastructure project. And that's exactly what's happened in the USA. So it's not because of who we are, it's because of the environment in which we operate in. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does make me quite sad because that is
Now know what the issue is. It's not an issue of buying transformers. It's not an issue
yeah,
of buying meters. It's an issue
yeah,
of, can I predict what will happen in 11 years time from now,
yeah,
given our political environment? And that is
yeah.
what financiers need.
Yeah, and you know why I said it's sad is because that's one of the reasons why the NESG was established, to promote a private sector driven economy. And this is the 31st year of the NESG's existence. And though there have been quite a lot of reforms and progress has been made, but we're really still back where we were 31 years ago. And I think the NESG's also recognized that you know, driving economic reforms without, you know, understanding that there's a need for political reforms, it's you know, it's also very dicey. So there needs to be that convergence at some point, and that's probably a decision we have to take as a nation, where we bring the two together, the politics and the economics, and then take a decision of how we want the next you know, 50 years or in 25 years to be. So whether we have a new national development plan, from everything I'm hearing today, it might still be at the same place we started from. So I'll take from if we have any questions, and then after that I'll wrap up. Any questions? Should I just read? I think there were 2 questions that I saw that were not answered. Okay, so Patrick Odiego asked that he missed the oil and gas session, and his question was whether licensed barite mining companies, what can they do to get the IOCs and national oil companies to directly purchase barite from licensed miners, as envisaged by the Local Content Act 2010 that stipulated that 60% of that should be locally sourced. Unfortunately, Patrick, I cannot answer that question at this session, but thankfully you are a member, and when the video for the first session is out, you can watch it, and then when we start the advocacy program on building, you know, strengthening the local content legislation, not just legislation, actually the practice, strengthening the oil and gas cluster. This, we will work towards answering this. Then the second question was Olua Busola FA. In addition to creating incentives, as rightly mentioned by Mr. Clark, how do we tackle public sector transparency and accountability for managing infrastructure financing? In addition, how are we ensuring evidence-based infrastructure investment? That is, what sectors or projects are priority for investment? Maybe do you want to answer that very quickly? Let's have a few minutes then.
You can't. Essentially, the only way you're gonna make sure the money is spent efficiently is to make sure the private sector spends it. However, you have a situation, and this is exactly in the power sector. And remember, I was at the CBN when we were doling out all the money. Once you create a situation which the private sector avoids, whether you do so deliberately or inadvertently, the only one you have left is for the public sector to do it. The public sector will do it, and I'm sorry, it will be inefficient, ineffective, and it won't last.
Hey,
You can't make the public
thank
sector
you.
do a job they're not designed to do.
Thank you for that. I think since we have a few more minutes, I could just ask every panelist if you have 1 to 2 minutes, last words, and then I wrap up. So I'll start with Kayode. Do you have any last minutes issues to share with us? Any points? 1 to 2 minutes.
Well, not really. I think it's just really to commend the NSG for the work that you've been doing all these years. I think it is obviously the way forward, but I think that we need to find a way in which the governments can not only listen but also implement some of the key recommendations you have been putting forward throughout all these years. As you can see, there are several solutions around the table. We always tend to know what we need to do, but the problem we always have is one of implementation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayode. Dr. Daju, any 1 to 2 minutes?
Yes, thank you so much. Just very briefly. I mean, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me, please?
Yes,
Oh boy, looks like my network.
we can hear you. Can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I just financial. I mean, I think Amanda, you're right. I think we need to do this study of seeing what's going on in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and what lessons can we learn. But I do know that stable policy framework, resource-based, that they, deploying their own competitive advantage, financial resources is one of the advantages they have over us. And interestingly, Ebi raised another perspective, which I've heard sometime before. Look, and I think that's what we probably trying to do in Nigeria, trying to make everybody happy, maybe for political reasons, maybe for another elections. But we need to take decisive actions, putting in mind that we need to industrialize Nigeria, and also putting Nigeria first, really putting Nigeria first. Interestingly, those economies in North Africa, they're not democracies. I mean, this is really very insightful. So further studies might need to just be done about this, and I'm available to do that. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. All right, Ebi, any last words? 1 to 2 minutes.
Okay, yes. The fundamental thing is we have to decide what sort of a society we are. Fundamentally, are we cooperative or are we competitive? And really, that's going to define the sort of the political economy. Now, underneath it, I don't think we really know the answer to that question. So given that we don't really know the answer to that question and we're a little bit, how do you call it, confused, the best thing to do would be to do something like set up special economic areas. Those economic areas have a large degree of autonomy to operate outside of whichever government area that they need to operate, and almost do something similar to what's called a charter city. Does anyone know what that is? A charter city sort of operates extra legislatively outside of the country and is allowed a large degree of freedom. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what degree of freedom are we prepared to give to, let's say, a particular area in this country, just to see how it develops, and perhaps to create these experimental zones that operate outside of Nigerian laws up to a point, and see how far they go. Because I don't think we will have the answers here by thinking and talking. It really is a question of let's run an experiment. And if experiments work, then maybe we can learn from those experiments ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Ebi. I picked this up and honestly, this aligns with the strategy, the advocacy that we're trying to do, building or encouraging the government to establish clusters around some of its commodities. We've already seen that there's an emerging oil and gas cluster where we're processing the oil and gas commodities into and refining them, and also manufacturing the equipments for the petroleum industry. So sort of what Norway has done, and it's called Norway's oil and gas cluster is in billions of dollars, worth billions of dollars. So creating this anyway, so we'll be in touch to see how we can apply this, and then we'll do a lot more study on this. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of today's session. And for me, what I've picked up from all the speakers is, okay, sorry, Rahila is going to close. I'll just wrap up the panel session. What I've gotten from here is that the Nigeria First provides the NESG, particularly the Industrial Policy Commission, with an entry point to serve as Nigeria's why for driving the reforms that we're pursuing to aid and accelerate Nigeria's industrialization. And here in the industrial PC and in the NESG as a whole, is that industrialization is an integration of manufacturing, all the infrastructure sectors, innovation, research and development, finance, trade, macroeconomics, and a whole education, youth development, environment. So all those policies integrated together to answer the question why. And the why is that we need to industrialize, accelerate industrialization, and that should be the focus of the government's attention. And once it achieves this, the whole benefits of industrialization will trickle down to the rest of the economy and to individuals. And that is what the SDG 9 on industrialization was designed. It's on manufacturing, it's on innovation. So if we are able to achieve SDG 9 on industrialization, it has been designed to enable a country achieve all the other SDGs. So thank you everyone for listening to the panel. Thank you to all the panelists for sharing your insights. Thank you. Over to you, Rahila.
Thanks, Amanda. Thank you very much. And thanks to Dr. Adaju, Kayode, Ebiperi for such an enriching discussion that we've had today. I think when you talk about infrastructure, I would say that electricity as part of that is arguably one of the most critical one to look at. And I found interesting the point that Ebiperi talked about when he raised the issue of the banks and the fact that, they would rather lend to the public sector than the private sector. And if you look at the power sector, that's pretty much what you see in the sense that the regulator has been trying to push for a bilateral contract market between the generators and the distribution business. However, this has not happened to the degree that the market will be sort of free to have that willing buyer, willing seller. And you ask the question, why? Why is that? And it just points to the fact that I, as a generator, would rather have the government owe me than a distribution company that perhaps is technically bankrupt, which Belije referenced in his presentation. So I'd rather be dealing with government. I don't mind how long, but I know that government will pay me. So there's a need for some sort of structural change. And I think for me, if we say that power is critical to everything, for all the discussions we've had today, everything points to power in one way or the other. You need to look at the liquidity and trying to address that. No investor or financier will be running this way if they can't see sight to how they recover that investment. if they can't, Ebipere talked about the economics of it. And I know that everywhere we go to, we talk about financing, and we often will say, and I think I've had this conversation personally with Ebipere, that finance is not the problem. We don't lack it. The issue is bankability. So I'm hoping that, I think that's one singular thing that we need to look at, the bankability of the entire value chain, and seeing how we make investors come in to say that if you bring your money, you'll get it over what period, and stability, certainty. Another thing that I think was touched during the conversation was strong institutions, which build trust. Strong institutions are the bedrock of social cohesion, economic prosperity, and effective governance. All this is what will pull finance towards sectors for industrialization. So yes, very, very interesting. Even the point, I know that Ebipere said he didn't want to be political, but he got into it a bit. I found that quite interesting, the Northern Africa, and the fact that you're looking at autocracy versus democracy. So again, very interesting and rich conversation. So today's pre-summit obviously ends the three-part series, which has provided strategic insights on industrialization, infrastructure, investments, and institutions. The outcome of these pre-summits will definitely help shape discussions at the 31st Nigerian Economic Summit, which we hope will translate into meaningful reforms, partnerships, and a bold execution. If we get it right, definitely Nigeria will be able to transition from a low productivity, resource-dependent industrial economy to a competitive, diversified, and technologically driven manufacturing base. Obviously, this is important to align with the African Union's Agenda 2063, AFTA, and the recently issued Nigeria First policy. So on behalf of the board and management of NESG, I thank all participants that made out time to join this session, and to all in the background that have made this series a success. I would like to use this opportunity, obviously, to also invite you all to be part of the 31st Nigerian Economic Summit, scheduled to take place on 6th to 8th of October, 2025. So until then, I wish all of you a great day, and thanks again for the panelists. Very, very rich discussion we had. Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. Back to you.
Okay, so thank you, Rahila, for the wrap up, and thank you to everyone who joined in. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to the NESG team in the background who worked tirelessly to achieve this. As Rahila said, we will take everything we've heard and discussed in these three-part series into the summit, where we'll be narrowing down to talk about the industrial policy. So thank you so much. We will also be sharing of these insights with the network threw me out. So thank you, everyone. And please join us here in the Nigerian Economic Summit group. You can join through the website, or I think the link was provided in the chat room. Thank you so much. We look forward to you joining and working with us to transform the Nigeria's industrial sector. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.